in the shadows of the ancient world, there existed a figure so terrifying that even death itself trembled before him. A sorcerer whose very name was whispered in hushed tones around dying embers, whose immortal reign cast darkness across generations of trembling villages. This is not a story of heroic knights or noble quests. This is the tale of absolute evil made flesh, of a being who conquered death not through virtue, but through the most twisted and malevolent of magics. Welcome to Vanishing Legends, where we journey into the forgotten corners of human imagination to uncover the monsters, myths, and mysteries that once ruled the hearts and minds of our ancestors. If you're fascinated by the dark folklore that shaped entire civilizations, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell, because we're about to descend into one of the most chilling legends ever conceived by the Slavic mind. Today, we're pulling back the veil on Koschei the Deathless, a figure whose very existence defies the natural order. He is the nightmare that haunted the collective unconscious of Eastern Europe for centuries. But who was this immortal tyrant? What dark secrets allowed him to cheat death itself? And why does his story continue to echo through our modern understanding of evil? To answer these questions, we must venture into a realm where mortality is not a certainty, where love becomes a weapon, and where the price of immortality is measured not in gold, but in the suffering of countless innocent souls. The story begins not in grand castles or shining kingdoms, but in the deep, impenetrable forests of old Russia, where the line between the world of the living and the realm of spirits was as thin as morning mist. It was here, in these primeval woodlands, that the ancient Slavs first whispered of a being who had committed the ultimate transgression against the cosmic order. Imagine, if you will, a world where death was not an ending, but a doorway, where the natural cycle of life, death, and renewal was sacred, woven into the very fabric of existence itself. The seasons turned, the harvests came and went, the old made way for the young, and in this eternal dance there was meaning, there was balance, there was peace. But Koschei rejected this sacred order. He looked upon death and said no. Not for him the gentle passage into the next world. Not for him the quiet dignity of accepting his mortal fate. Instead, he chose a path so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that it transformed him from a man into something far worse than any beast that prowled the midnight forests. The earliest tales speak of him as a powerful sorcerer, a man who had delved so deeply into the forbidden arts that he had touched the very essence of existence itself. But power, as the old stories teach us, always comes with a price. And the price Koschei paid was his humanity. Through rituals so dark that even the ancient storytellers dared not speak their details, he achieved what no mortal man should ever possess: true immortality. But this was not the blessed eternal life promised by the gods to the righteous. This was a cursed existence, a mockery of the divine order that left him forever hungry, forever wanting, forever incomplete. You see, Koschei's immortality came with a terrible weakness, a flaw that would become central to every tale told about him. His death, his very soul, was not contained within his body. Instead, through his dark magic, he had hidden it away, secreted in the most impossible of places, protected by layer upon layer of mystical guardians. The most famous version of this legend tells us that his death lay hidden inside a needle, and the needle was in an egg, and the egg was in a duck, and the duck was in a hare, and the hare was in a chest, and the chest was buried beneath an oak tree on a remote island in the middle of an enchanted lake. Only by finding this needle and breaking it could Koschei finally be destroyed. This elaborate protection made him effectively invincible, but it also revealed the fundamental corruption at his core. A normal man's soul resides within his body, connected to his heart, his mind, his very essence. But Koschei had torn his soul from himself, had rejected the natural unity of body and spirit that defines human existence. And what did this immortal monster do with his endless years? Did he use his eternal life to build, to create, to make the world a better place? Did he become a wise teacher, sharing the knowledge of ages with those who came after him? No. Koschei became something far more sinister. He became a collector, not of gold or jewels or works of art, but of something far more precious and infinitely more terrible. He collected beautiful young women, princesses and peasant girls alike, stealing them away from their families, their loves, their lives, and imprisoning them in his dark castle at the edge of the world. These were not mere kidnappings driven by lust or loneliness. This was something deeper, more twisted. Koschei, having rejected his own humanity, became obsessed with possessing the humanity of others, the youth he had sacrificed, the love he had abandoned, the natural beauty he had corrupted within himself. He sought to steal from others and hoard like a dragon hoards treasure. His victims were kept in towers of impossible height, guarded by magical barriers and monstrous servants. They were preserved in a kind of living death, their youth maintained by his sorcery, their beauty intact, but their spirits slowly withering away in captivity. They became living dolls in his collection, beautiful objects to be admired but never truly loved, never allowed to grow, to change, to live. But Koschei's evil went beyond mere imprisonment. The stories tell us that he was a master of transformation, able to take any shape he desired. Sometimes he appeared as a handsome prince to deceive his victims. Other times he manifested as a terrible dragon, breathing fire and death upon any who dared to oppose him. He could become a whirlwind, a shadow, or even possess the bodies of others to do his bidding. This shape-shifting ability made him not just a physical threat, but a psychological one. His victims never knew when he might appear, in what form, or through what deception. Trust became impossible. Love became dangerous. Hope became a weapon he could turn against those who dared to dream of freedom. The tales speak of heroes who rose to challenge him, brave princes and clever peasants who sought to rescue the maidens he had stolen. But these were not simple battles between good and evil. Koschei's immortality made him nearly invincible in direct combat. Instead, the heroes had to match his cunning with their own, his magic with their courage, his twisted intelligence with their pure hearts. The most famous of these heroes was Ivan Tsarevich, a prince whose beloved, Vasilisa the Beautiful, had been stolen by the deathless sorcerer. Ivan's quest to rescue her would take him to the very edges of the known world, through forests where the trees themselves were Koschei's spies, across rivers that ran with liquid moonlight, and into the realm of Baba Yaga herself, the witch of the woods, who alone possessed the knowledge needed to defeat the immortal monster. But even as these heroes fought against him, Koschei remained a step ahead, always watching, always planning, always finding new ways to corrupt the natural order and bend it to his will. He was not merely evil, he was the very embodiment of evil, a cancer upon the world that spread its influence wherever he walked. His castle, perched on the edge of reality itself, became a monument to his twisted nature. Built from the bones of his enemies and roofed with the tears of his victims, it stood as a testament to what happens when power is pursued without wisdom, when immortality is sought without understanding, when a man chooses to become a monster. And yet, for all his power, for all his cunning, for all his dark magic, Koschei carried within himself the seeds of his own destruction. His immortality, the very thing that made him so terrifying, also made him fundamentally incomplete. He was a puzzle missing its most important piece, a story without an ending, a song without a final note. The heroes who faced him understood this weakness, even when they could not fully comprehend it. They knew that somewhere, hidden away in his elaborate defenses, lay the key to his defeat. Not just the physical needle that contained his death, but the spiritual truth that no being, no matter how powerful, can exist forever in opposition to the natural order of existence. This understanding would prove crucial in the greatest of all tales told about the deathless sorcerer, for it was not through brute force or superior magic that Koschei would ultimately face his downfall, but through something he had long ago abandoned and could never truly comprehend. Something that would expose the hollow core at the center of his immortal existence. But before we delve into that climactic confrontation, we must first understand the true scope of Koschei's influence upon the Slavic imagination. He was not merely a villain in isolated fairy tales. He was the shadow that fell across an entire culture's understanding of power, death, and the price of defying the natural order. The ancient Slavic peoples lived in a world where the boundaries between life and death, between the natural and supernatural, were fluid and permeable. Their shamans spoke with spirits, their wise women read the future in the flight of birds, and their warriors carried charms blessed by forces older than memory itself. In this world, death was not an enemy to be conquered, but a teacher to be respected. Death brought meaning to life, urgency to love, and wisdom to those who would listen. The seasons died and were reborn. The forests shed their leaves only to bloom again. And even the mightiest kings and heroes eventually laid down their swords and passed into legend. This cycle was not seen as tragic, but as sacred, as necessary, as the very heartbeat of existence itself. Koschei represented the ultimate violation of this sacred understanding. He was the man who had said no to the fundamental truth of existence, who had chosen stagnation over growth, possession over love, and control over acceptance. In rejecting death, he had also rejected life itself, becoming a kind of walking contradiction, a being who existed but did not truly live. The storytellers who first shaped his legend understood this on a profound level. They crafted his character not as a simple antagonist, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the folly of trying to escape the human condition. Every aspect of his being, from his hidden death to his obsession with collecting beautiful prisoners, reflected this central theme of corruption through the rejection of natural law. His very name carries weight in the old tongue. Koschei, derived from the word for bone, for skeleton, for the framework that remains when life has departed. He was death without dying, structure without substance, power without purpose. He had become his own monument, a testament to everything he had sacrificed in his quest for immortality. The tales tell us that his reign of terror stretched across centuries, perhaps millennia. Kingdoms rose and fell while he remained unchanged, watching from his dark castle as generations of mortals lived their brief, bright lives and then faded into memory. He saw empires crumble, witnessed the birth of new faiths and the death of old gods, observed the slow march of human progress with the cold detachment of one who had placed himself outside the flow of time itself. And yet, for all his accumulated years and experience, Koschei learned nothing. Wisdom requires change, growth, the ability to admit error and choose a different path. But the deathless sorcerer was incapable of true change. His immortality had frozen him in a single moment of selfish ambition, trapping him in patterns of behavior that grew more twisted and obsessive with each passing age. His collection of imprisoned maidens grew ever larger, filling tower after tower in his impossible castle. But the joy he sought to steal from them remained forever beyond his grasp. Beauty without freedom becomes merely decoration. Youth without growth becomes stagnation. Love without choice becomes possession. And possession, as Koschei discovered too late, is the opposite of everything he truly hungered for. The stories describe his increasing desperation as the centuries wore on, the fresh cruelties he devised, the ever more elaborate schemes to capture new victims, the growing paranoia about the safety of his hidden death. He became a creature of pure need, a void that could never be filled, a hunger that could never be satisfied. And it was this very desperation that would ultimately provide the opening his enemies needed. For in his obsession with collecting and controlling others, Koschei had forgotten a fundamental truth about human nature. The very qualities that made his victims worth stealing. Their capacity for love, for sacrifice, for courage in the face of impossible odds, were also the qualities that would eventually lead to his downfall. The tale of Ivan Tsarevich and his quest to rescue Vasilisa the Beautiful represents the culmination of all these themes. Here was a hero who embodied everything Koschei had abandoned. Where the sorcerer sought to possess love, Ivan sought to serve it. Where Koschei hoarded life, Ivan was willing to risk his own. Where Koschei had become isolated and self-serving, Ivan gathered allies and accepted help from the most unlikely sources. The journey itself became a kind of spiritual education, a process of learning that stood in stark contrast to Koschei's stagnant immortality. Ivan faced tests that required not just courage and cunning, but wisdom and compassion. He had to prove himself worthy not through conquest, but through understanding. Each challenge he overcame brought him closer not just to his goal, but to becoming the kind of person capable of defeating an immortal evil. This is why the stories of Koschei have endured for so many centuries. They speak to something deeper than mere entertainment or moral instruction. They address the fundamental questions that every human being must face. What does it mean to live a meaningful life? How do we find purpose in the face of mortality? What happens when we allow fear of death to corrupt our capacity for love? The ancient storytellers who crafted these tales understood that true horror comes not from external monsters, but from the monsters we create within ourselves. Koschei is terrifying, not because he is alien or incomprehensible, but because he represents a possibility that exists within every human heart. The temptation to choose safety over growth, control over freedom, possession over love. In this sense, every person who encounters these stories is forced to confront their own potential for becoming like Koschei. We all face moments when the easy path seems to be the selfish one, when the fear of loss tempts us to grasp too tightly to what we have, when the desire for control threatens to override our respect for the autonomy of others. The genius of the folklore lies in how it presents this internal struggle through the external drama of heroes and monsters, quests and rescues, magic and adventure. The surface narrative provides excitement and wonder, while the deeper layers offer wisdom and insight into the human condition itself. And here, at this moment in our exploration of the legend, we stand at the threshold of understanding not just who Koschei was, but why his story matters. For the true battle was never between a hero and a monster, but between two different ways of understanding what it means to be human. The confrontation between Ivan and Koschei was not destined to be a simple battle of sword against sorcery. No, this was something far more profound, a collision between two fundamentally different philosophies of existence itself. As Ivan drew closer to the deathless sorcerer's domain, he was entering not just a physical location, but a realm where the very laws of nature had been bent to serve one man's twisted will. The approach to Koschei's castle revealed the true extent of his corruption. The very landscape around his fortress had been warped by centuries of his presence. Trees grew in impossible spirals, their branches reaching down into the earth, while their roots clawed at the sky. Rivers flowed uphill, defying gravity itself, carrying not water but liquid shadow that whispered secrets too terrible for mortal ears. The ground beneath Ivan's feet felt wrong, as if it remembered every drop of innocent blood that had been spilled upon it. But perhaps most unsettling of all were the gardens that surrounded the castle. Here, Koschei had created a mockery of natural beauty, a collection of living statues that had once been his victims, young women transformed into flowering trees, their faces still visible in the bark, their eyes eternally weeping sap. Warriors turned to stone, forever frozen in their final moments of defiance. Children became singing birds trapped in cages of their own ribs, their voices creating haunting melodies that spoke of homes they would never see again. This was the true horror of Koschei's immortality. It was not enough for him to simply avoid death. He had to impose his stagnation upon everything around him, creating a realm where nothing could grow, change, or find peace. His castle stood as a monument to this philosophy, built not from mere stone and mortar, but from the crystallized suffering of countless victims. As Ivan crossed the threshold into this nightmare realm, he felt the weight of Koschei's attention upon him like a physical presence. The deathless sorcerer had been watching his approach, studying this new challenger with the cold calculation of a predator that had never known defeat. But there was something different about this particular hero, something that stirred an emotion Koschei had thought himself incapable of feeling. Fear, not fear of death, for death could not touch him while his soul remained hidden. Not fear of pain, for his immortal body could heal from any wound. No, this was a deeper terror, the fear that perhaps his carefully constructed world of control and possession might not be as absolute as he had believed. For the first time in centuries, Koschei felt uncertainty creeping into his thoughts, like poison seeping into a well. The confrontation began not with violence, but with words. Koschei appeared before Ivan in his most magnificent form, towering and terrible, wreathed in shadows that seemed to devour the very light around them. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of ages, the accumulated power of centuries spent in defiance of the natural order. He offered Ivan everything a mortal man could desire: wealth beyond measure, power over kingdoms, knowledge of secrets that could reshape the world itself. He even offered him a form of immortality, a chance to join him in his eternal existence above the petty concerns of mortal life. All Ivan had to do was abandon his quest, leave Vasilisa to her fate, and accept Koschei as his master. But Ivan's response revealed the fundamental difference between them. Where Koschei saw only what could be taken, possessed, controlled, Ivan saw what could be given, shared, protected. His love for Vasilisa was not about ownership, but about service. His desire to rescue her came not from a need to possess her beauty, but from a recognition of her inherent worth as a free being capable of choosing her own destiny. This distinction cut through Koschei's offers, like a blade through shadow. The sorcerer's immortality, for all its power, had made him incapable of understanding the very thing he most desperately wanted. True connection with another being required vulnerability, the willingness to risk loss, the acceptance that love could not be compelled or contained. These were lessons that could only be learned by those who faced mortality with courage rather than fleeing from it in terror. The battle that followed was unlike any conflict recorded in the ancient tales. It was not merely a physical struggle, but a war between two different visions of what life should be. Koschei unleashed powers that had been accumulating for millennia, transforming the very air into weapons, calling upon creatures from the darkest corners of existence, bending reality itself to his will. But Ivan fought with something Koschei could not understand or counter. Every blow he struck was motivated not by hatred or ambition, but by love. Every spell he deflected was turned aside not through superior magic, but through unshakable faith in the righteousness of his cause. Every wound he suffered only strengthened his resolve, for he understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. The tide of battle turned when Ivan realized that defeating Koschei was not about matching his power, but about exposing his weakness. The sorcerer's immortality was not a strength, but a prison, a cage he had built for himself out of his own fear and selfishness. His hidden death was not a clever protection, but a symbol of his fundamental disconnection from his own humanity. As the combat raged through the halls of the Nightmare Castle, Ivan began to understand the true nature of his quest. He was not simply trying to rescue one captive princess. He was fighting to restore the natural order itself, to prove that love was stronger than fear, that growth was more powerful than stagnation, that acceptance of mortality was the key to truly living. The moment of revelation came when Ivan found himself in Koschei's treasure chamber, surrounded by all the beautiful things the sorcerer had stolen over the centuries. Here were artifacts of immense power, artworks of breathtaking beauty, and in the center of it all, the towers where Koschei kept his collection of imprisoned maidens. But as Ivan looked upon this vast hoard, he saw it for what it truly was. Not a collection of treasures, but a museum of Koschei's failures. Every stolen object represented something the sorcerer had been unable to create himself. Every captive maiden reflected his inability to inspire genuine love or loyalty. The entire chamber was a monument to emptiness, a void decorated with the stolen light of others. This understanding gave Ivan the key he needed. Koschei's death was hidden not just in a physical location, but in a psychological truth. The needle containing his soul was protected not just by magical guardians, but by the sorcerer's own inability to confront what he had become. To find it, Ivan would have to navigate not just the physical obstacles Koschei had created, but the labyrinth of self-deception and denial that surrounded the sorcerer's heart. The quest for the needle became a journey through the geography of evil itself. Each guardian Ivan faced represented a different aspect of Koschei's corruption. The oak tree that concealed the chest had roots that fed on the despair of the sorcerer's victims. The island where it grew was surrounded by waters that reflected not the sky above, but the darkness within Koschei's soul. The chest itself was locked not with any key of metal, but with the accumulated weight of all the choices that had led the sorcerer down his path of damnation. Inside the chest, the hair that contained the duck moved with the restless energy of Koschei's own inability to find peace. The duck that held the egg flew in endless circles, trapped like its master in patterns of behavior that led nowhere. And the egg itself, when finally captured, pulsed with a heartbeat that had not known love for centuries beyond counting. But it was the needle itself that revealed the ultimate truth about Koschei's nature. As Ivan held it in his hands, he could feel the weight of the sorcerer's soul, and what he felt was not evil so much as emptiness. Here was a being who had gained everything he thought he wanted, and discovered that it was nothing at all. The needle trembled not with power, but with loneliness so profound that it had become a kind of madness. At that moment, Ivan faced a choice that would define not just his own character, but the very meaning of the tale itself. He could simply break the needle and end Koschei's existence, bringing justice to a monster who had caused untold suffering across the centuries. Or he could try to offer the sorcerer something he had never received in all his long years of existence: understanding, compassion, a chance at redemption. This choice was the true test of Ivan's heroism. Anyone could slay a monster out of hatred or revenge, but could he face the deepest evil with love still in his heart? Could he offer mercy to one who had shown none to others? Could he prove that the philosophy of life he championed was strong enough to encompass even its greatest enemy? The answer to these questions would determine not just the fate of Koschei, but the ultimate message of the story itself. For the ancient storytellers understood that the most powerful tales were not those that simply divided the world into good and evil, but those that explored the complex territory where these forces met and struggled for dominance in every human heart. As Ivan stood in that moment of decision, the needle containing Koschei's soul in his hands, he embodied the eternal human struggle between justice and mercy, between the desire for revenge and the call to forgiveness. The choice he made would echo through the centuries, carried forward by every person who heard his tale, and had to decide what kind of person they wanted to be when faced with their own encounters with evil. But here on Vanishing Legends, We know that the most profound stories are those that refuse to give easy answers. They present us with impossible choices and trust us to find our own wisdom in the struggle to understand them. The legend of Koschei the Deathless is one such story, a mirror that reflects not just the darkness that can consume a human soul, but the light that can pierce even the deepest shadows. The confrontation between Ivan and Koschei was reaching its climax, but the true battle was only beginning. For the greatest enemy was not the immortal sorcerer in his dark castle, but the capacity for evil that exists within every human heart, the temptation to choose power over love, control over freedom, possession over connection. The decision Ivan faced in that moment would determine the very soul of the story itself. But before we witness the climax of this ancient struggle, I want you to think about something. Every culture throughout history has created monsters that represent their deepest fears. If you're fascinated by these dark mirrors of human nature and want to explore more legendary creatures that haunted our ancestors, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because here on Vanishing Legends, we don't just tell stories, we excavate the buried truths that shape civilizations. Now, as Ivan held that trembling needle, the weight of centuries pressing down upon him, something extraordinary began to happen. The very air around him started to shimmer and warp, as if reality itself was responding to the proximity of Koschei's hidden soul. The walls of the chamber groaned and shifted, and suddenly Ivan found himself no longer in the treasure room, but standing in a vast, empty plain under a starless sky. Before him materialized Koschei himself, but not as the towering, terrible sorcerer Ivan had faced in battle. This was Koschei as he truly was, stripped of all his magical disguises and accumulated power. He appeared as a man, ancient beyond measure, his eyes holding the accumulated weight of every choice that had led him down this path of damnation. And in those eyes, for the first time, Ivan saw something he had not expected to find. Pain. The sorcerer's voice when he spoke was barely a whisper. The needle in Ivan's hand pulsed with each word, as if the very act of speech was agony for one whose soul had been torn from his body so long ago. Koschei did not threaten or bargain now. Instead, he asked a question that cut through centuries of accumulated evil like light through darkness. He asked Ivan why he had come so far, risked so much, faced such terrible dangers for the sake of one woman, not out of mockery or cruelty, but out of genuine bewilderment. In all his endless years, Koschei had never understood what could motivate such sacrifice. What power could be greater than self-preservation? What force could drive a mortal man to face an immortal monster? Ivan's answer came not in words, but in a memory that suddenly filled the empty plain around them. The space transformed into a vision of the moment he had first seen Vasilisa, not as a prize to be won or a treasure to be possessed, but as a person whose joy in simply being alive had illuminated everything around her. Her laughter echoing across a meadow, her kindness to a wounded bird, her courage in defending those weaker than herself. This was what Koschei had stolen and imprisoned in his dark tower. Not just a beautiful woman, but the very essence of life's potential for goodness. As the vision played out around them, Ivan watched something extraordinary happen to the deathless sorcerer. Koschei began to remember, not the twisted justifications he had built over the centuries, but the truth of what he had once been before his fall into darkness. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam, and with them came the full weight of what he had lost in his quest for immortality. He remembered the moment he had first faced his own mortality, the terror that had driven him to seek the forbidden knowledge that would free him from death's embrace. But he also remembered what had come before that moment, a time when he too had been capable of love, of sacrifice, of seeing beauty in the world around him. A time when he had been simply and completely human. The revelation was devastating. For the first time in millennia, Koschei understood the true nature of his curse. He had not escaped death by hiding his soul in the needle. He had escaped life. Every moment of his immortal existence had been a kind of death, a gradual erosion of everything that had made him truly alive. His collection of beautiful prisoners, his hoard of stolen treasures, his elaborate fortress of power, all of it had been an attempt to fill a void that he himself had created when he chose fear over faith, control over connection. But understanding his curse and being able to break it were two very different things. The magic that bound his soul to the needle had been woven so deeply into the fabric of his being that even Koschei himself could not simply choose to undo it. He had become trapped in his own spell, a prisoner of the very power he had sought to master. The needle in Ivan's hand held not just his death, but his only possible hope for redemption. This was the moment when Ivan truly understood the nature of his quest. He had not come to destroy a monster, but to free a man who had become his own worst enemy. The choice before him was not between justice and mercy, but between two different kinds of justice. He could break the needle and end Koschei's suffering through death, or he could find another way to break the spell that had trapped the sorcerer in his immortal prison. But how does one break a curse that has been centuries in the making? How does one restore a soul that has been severed from its body by the darkest of magics? The answer came to Ivan not through his own wisdom, but through the very love that had brought him so far. For as he held the needle and felt the weight of Koschei's trapped soul, he realized that the spell had a weakness the sorcerer himself had never recognized. Hey! The magic that bound Koschei's soul to the needle was powered by his own fear of death, his rejection of the natural order, his refusal to accept the vulnerability that came with true connection to another being. But that same magic could be transformed by its opposite, not destroyed, but redeemed through the willing sacrifice of someone who understood what Koschei had forgotten. That love was stronger than fear, that connection was more powerful than control, that accepting mortality was the key to truly living. Ivan made his choice with the clarity that comes only to those who have looked into the heart of darkness and chosen light anyway. Instead of breaking the needle, he pressed it against his own chest, directly over his heart. The magic that had trapped Koschei's soul for centuries suddenly had a new target, a new vessel, but one that offered something the original spell had never known: willing sacrifice. The transformation that followed was beyond the power of words to fully describe. The needle dissolved not in violence, but in light, and with it went the elaborate magical protections that had sustained Koschei's immortality. But instead of simply dying, the sorcerer found himself facing something far more terrifying and far more wonderful than death. He found himself truly alive for the first time in centuries. The change was immediate and overwhelming. His immortal body, sustained for so long by stolen life force, began to age rapidly, but instead of horror, Koschei felt relief. The weight of endless years began to lift from his shoulders. The hollow ache where his soul should have been began to fill with sensations he had forgotten he was capable of feeling: compassion, regret, hope, and underneath it all, flowing like a river that had finally found its way to the sea, came something he had thought lost forever: the capacity to love. But this transformation came at a price. Ivan's willing sacrifice had broken Koschei's curse, but it had also created a connection between them that transcended the normal boundaries of individual existence. They were now bound together, not by magic, but by something far deeper. Ivan's act of mercy had created a debt that could only be repaid through service, and Koschei found himself compelled not by external force, but by his own newly awakened conscience to dedicate whatever time remained to him to undoing the damage he had caused across the centuries. The first and most important task was the rescue of Vasilisa and all the other prisoners in his dark castle. But this was not a simple matter of unlocking doors and breaking chains. Many of his victims had been transformed by his magic, turned into trees and stones and singing birds. Others had been held captive for so long that they had forgotten what freedom even meant. The work of healing would take time, patience, and a kind of magic that Koschei was only beginning to learn. The magic of genuine care for another's well-being. As the two men worked together to undo centuries of accumulated evil, something remarkable began to happen. The corrupted landscape around Koschei's castle began to heal. Rivers that had flowed uphill returned to their proper courses. Trees that had grown in impossible spirals straightened and began to bear fruit. The very air, which had carried whispers of despair, now sang with the voices of birds returning to nests they had long abandoned. But perhaps the most profound transformation was taking place within Koschei himself. Each act of kindness, each moment of genuine concern for his former victims, each choice to put another's needs before his own, was slowly rebuilding the humanity he had thought lost forever. He was learning to be mortal again and discovering that mortality was not a curse to be escaped, but a gift to be treasured. The process was not without its challenges. Centuries of selfish behavior had created patterns of thought and emotion that could not be changed overnight. There were moments when the old Koschei would surface, when the temptation to return to his former ways of controlling and possessing would overwhelm his newfound conscience. But each time this happened, Ivan was there, not as a judge or a jailer, but as a friend who understood the difficulty of choosing love over fear again and again in each moment of each day. The former sorcerer also had to face the full weight of what he had done during his reign of terror. The families destroyed, the lives cut short, the potential for goodness that had been snuffed out by his selfish choices. This reckoning was perhaps the hardest part of his transformation, for it required him to feel the full impact of his actions not as abstractions, but as real suffering inflicted upon real people who had deserved better. Yet even in this darkness, there were moments of unexpected grace. Some of his former victims, once freed from their enchantments and given time to heal, chose to forgive him, not because his crimes were not serious, but because they understood that forgiveness was not about excusing the past, but about freeing themselves from the chains of hatred that could bind them as surely as any magical spell. Others could not forgive, and Koschei learned to accept this as well. He understood that redemption was not a simple transaction where good deeds could cancel out past evil. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely, some losses too profound to ever be fully restored. His task was not to earn forgiveness, but to live in such a way that no new harm would come from his hands. As the seasons turned and the work of healing continued, Koschei began to feel something he had never experienced during his immortal years. He began to feel time passing, to sense the approach of his own natural death, and instead of terror, this awareness brought him a kind of peace he had never known. He was finally rejoining the natural order he had spent so long defying. The irony was not lost on him. In seeking to escape death, he had missed out on life itself. Now, in accepting his mortality, he was discovering what it truly meant to be alive. Each day became precious precisely because it was limited. Each moment of connection with another person carried weight because it might be among his last. The approaching end of his existence did not diminish its meaning, but revealed it. But here on Vanishing Legends, we understand that the most powerful stories are those that leave us with questions rather than easy answers. What does it mean to truly live? Can anyone be redeemed no matter how far they have fallen? Is it possible to undo the damage caused by a lifetime of selfish choices? These are the questions that the legend of Koschei forces us to confront. and they are questions each of us must answer for ourselves. The transformation of Koschei the Deathless into Koschei the Mortal was not the end of his story, but perhaps its true beginning. For the first time in centuries, he was living rather than merely existing, growing rather than stagnating, connecting rather than consuming. He had discovered that the secret of life was not to be found in avoiding death, but in embracing the precious, fragile, beautiful experience of being temporarily alive in a universe full of wonder. And Ivan, through his act of sacrificial love, had learned something equally profound: that true heroism was not about defeating monsters, but about seeing the humanity that still flickered within them. That the greatest victories were not won through violence, but through the courage to offer mercy even to those who seemed least deserving of it. That love was indeed stronger than death, not because it could prevent dying, but because it could transform the meaning of living. As our tale draws toward its conclusion, we are left not with the simple satisfaction of seeing good triumph over evil, but with something far more complex and far more meaningful. We different people, but through the heart of every person, are left with the understanding that the line between monster and hero runs not between that each of us carries within ourselves the capacity for both great good and terrible evil, and that our choices in each moment determine which of these possibilities we will manifest in the world. The legend of Koschei the Deathless thus becomes more than just a story about an ancient sorcerer and the hero who faced him. It becomes a mirror in which we can see our own struggles with mortality, our own temptations to choose control over love, our own need for redemption, and the possibility of transformation that exists even in the darkest corners of the human heart. But the transformation of Koschei was not merely a personal redemption. It sent ripples through the very fabric of the supernatural world that had known him as an unchanging constant for so many centuries. Word spread through the hidden realms where spirits dwell and ancient powers hold court. The deathless sorcerer was deathless no more. The tyrant who had defied the natural order had finally submitted to its wisdom. This news reached the ears of beings who had waited lifetimes for this moment. Baba Yaga herself emerged from her chicken-legged hut, her iron teeth gleaming in something that might have been a smile. She had always known that Koschei's reign would eventually end, but she had expected it to come through violence, not through the strange alchemy of compassion and sacrifice she had witnessed. Other creatures of the old world began to stir. Forest spirits who had hidden in the deepest groves to escape Koschei's influence crept back into the light. Rivers that had been poisoned by his presence began to run clear again. Even the stars seemed to shine brighter, as if the very cosmos was celebrating the restoration of balance to a world that had been tilted toward darkness for far too long. But perhaps the most profound change was felt by the ordinary people of the Slavic lands. Peasants and princes alike had lived their entire lives under the shadow of old sorcerer, who stole beautiful whispered warnings about the immortal Koschei's legend. Children had grown up hearing over their shoulders when walking maidens. Young women had wondered if they would have the courage to face such versus evil into something far more complex and attention of the deathless one, warriors alone, fearing they might catch the A foe if the need arose. Now suddenly that the parents told their children began to change. Immortal Monster had been not destroyed, but transformed. The story shadow was lifting. The impossible had happened. The evolving from a simple tale of good, ultimately more hopeful. For if even Koschei could find redemption, then perhaps there was hope for everyone who struggled with the darkness in their own hearts. The castle that had stood for centuries as a monument to selfish ambition began to crumble as the magic that had sustained it finally faded. But instead of collapsing into ruin, it transformed into something entirely new. Gardens bloomed where torture chambers had been. Fountains of clear water sprang up, where pools of tears had once reflected the sorrow of countless victims. The very stones seemed to sing with relief as they were finally freed from their dark purpose. Ivan and Vasilisa, reunited at last, chose to remain for a time to help with the great work of healing. Their love, which had been the catalyst for Koschei's transformation, became a beacon of hope for all those who had suffered under his reign. They showed by their example that it was possible to face the deepest darkness and emerge not hardened by hatred, but strengthened by compassion. Vasilisa herself proved to be more than just a rescued princess. Her time in captivity, terrible as it had been, had taught her things about resilience and courage that she now used to help heal others who had endured similar traumas. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the long journey from victim to survivor to someone who could offer hope to others' own darkness. Still trapped in there, as for Koschei, he found that mortality brought gifts he had never imagined during his immortal years. The simple pleasure of tasting food, really tasting it, instead of consuming it merely as fuel for his undead existence. The warmth of sunlight on his skin, no longer filtered through layers of protective magic. The sound of genuine laughter, not the hollow echoes that had filled his castle for so long. He discovered the joy of useful work, of using his hands to build rather than destroy. His knowledge of magic, once employed for domination and terror, became a tool for healing and restoration. Spells that had once transformed people into objects of beauty for his collection were reversed and refined into magic that could mend broken hearts and restore lost hope. But perhaps most precious of all was the gift of friendship. The bond that had formed between him and Ivan during those crucial moments of transformation had deepened into something neither man had expected. Here was companionship without manipulation, trust without coercion, loyalty freely given rather than magically compelled. Through Ivan's example, Koschei learned what he had never understood during his centuries of isolation. That true strength came not from standing apart from others, but from choosing to stand with them. That wisdom was not something to be hoarded, but to be shared. That power was most meaningful when it was used in service of something greater than oneself. The seasons turned, and with each passing month, Koschei felt the approach of his natural end more clearly. His body, no longer sustained by stolen vitality, began to show the wear of his many years. His hair grew white, his steps became slower, his hands began to tremble with age. But instead of mourning these changes, he welcomed them as signs that he was finally living as he should have all along. He began to make preparations for his death with the same meticulous care he had once devoted to avoiding it. He wrote down everything he had learned about the nature of magic and power, not as instructions for future sorcerers, but as warnings about the dangers of choosing the path he had once walked. He visited each of his former victims who would receive him, offering what apologies and restitution he could, even when he knew they could never fully yield it. Most importantly, he worked to heal the wounds he had infouled with Ivan to establish something that had never existed before in the supernatural world of the Slavic lands. A sanctuary, a place where those who had been touched by dark magic could come to heal, where former monsters could seek redemption, where the line between good and evil could be explored safely by those brave enough to examine their own hearts. This sanctuary would become Koschei's true legacy, far more meaningful than any of the dark monuments he had built during his immortal years. It would stand as proof that transformation was possible, that even the most twisted soul could find its way back to the light, that redemption was not just a beautiful dream, but a real possibility for anyone willing to do the difficult work of becoming truly human. But the story of Koschei's redemption was not without its critics. There were those who argued that some sins were too great to be forgiven, some damage too severe to be repaired. They pointed to the countless lives that had been lost or ruined during his reign of terror, and asked whether his transformation truly balanced the scales of justice. These were not easy questions to answer, and Koschei himself struggled with them daily. He understood that his newfound mortality and good intentions could not bring back the dead or undo the trauma he had inflicted. He learned to live with the knowledge that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about ensuring that the future would be different. The debate over his transformation spread throughout the Slavic world, carried by traveling merchants and wandering storytellers. Some versions of the tale emphasize the possibility of redemption for even the worst sinners. Others focused on the importance of justice and the danger of allowing evil to escape consequences. Still others explored the complex relationship between mercy and accountability, between forgiveness and enabling. These different versions reflected the diverse perspectives of the people who told and retold the story. Each community, each individual, brought their own experiences with forgiveness and redemption to their understanding of Koschei's tale. The story became a mirror in which each culture could examine its own beliefs about the nature of justice and the possibility of change. In some tellings, Koschei's redemption was complete and unqualified, a triumph of love over evil that proved the fundamental goodness of the human spirit. In others, his transformation was partial and ongoing, a lifelong struggle to overcome the patterns of behavior that had defined him for centuries. Still others suggested that true redemption was impossible for someone who had done so much harm, and that the best he could hope for was to minimize the damage he caused going forward. But perhaps the most powerful versions were those that left the question open, inviting listeners to draw their own conclusions about what justice and redemption truly meant. These stories recognized that the line between good and evil was not fixed and absolute, but was something that each person had to navigate for themselves, guided by their own conscience and understanding of right and wrong. As Koschei's final days approached, he found himself facing the same fear that had driven him to seek immortality in the first place. But now, instead of running from that fear, he chose to examine it, to understand what it could teach him about the nature of existence itself. He discovered that death was not the enemy he had imagined it to be, but rather a teacher whose lessons could only be learned by those willing to listen with an open heart. The approach of his own end gave new urgency to his work of making amends. He traveled throughout the lands where his influence had once spread terror, seeking out those he had wronged, offering what healing he could, and learning to accept when healing was not possible. Each encounter taught him something new about the complex relationship between forgiveness and accountability, between redemption and justice. He also spent long hours in conversation with Ivan, sharing the wisdom he had gained through his centuries of experience, both dark and light. These discussions were not just about magic or power, but about the fundamental questions that every human being must face. What gives life meaning? How do we find purpose in the face of mortality? What legacy do we want to leave behind? Through these conversations, both men came to understand that the story of Koschei was not really about a sorcerer and a hero, but about the eternal human struggle to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, growth over stagnation. It was a story that spoke to anyone who had ever faced the temptation to take the easy path of selfishness instead of the harder path of compassion. The final chapter of Koschei's story began on a morning when the first frost of winter touched the ground around the sanctuary he had helped to build. He awoke knowing, with the certainty that comes to those who have made peace with their mortality, that his time was nearly at an end. But instead of despair, he felt a deep sense of completion, the satisfaction of a life that had finally found its proper purpose. He spent his last day visiting each part of the sanctuary, speaking with the people who had come there seeking healing, offering final words of encouragement to those who were struggling with their own transformations. He walked through the gardens that had replaced his torture chambers, listened to the fountains that had replaced his pools of tears, and marveled at how something so beautiful. As evening approached, he gathered with Ivan, Vasilisa, and the others who could have grown from soil that had once been watered with so much suffering, had become his chosen family during these final years. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set, each lost in their own thoughts about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. There were no grand speeches or dramatic revelations, just the quiet presence of people who had learned to love each other despite, or perhaps because of, the darkness they had all faced. When death finally came for Koschei, it came not as the terrifying spectre he had spent centuries fleeing, but as a gentle friend welcoming him home after a long and difficult journey. His last words were not of regret or fear, but of gratitude for the gift of having been allowed to discover, even at the end of his long life, what it truly meant to be human. His passing marked the end of an era in the supernatural world of the Slavic lands. The age of the immortal monsters who stood apart from the natural order was over. In its place came a new understanding that even the most powerful beings were part of the great web of existence, subject to the same laws of growth, change, and eventual transformation that governed all living things. The sanctuary that Koschei had helped to establish continued to thrive long after his death, becoming a beacon of hope for anyone who struggled with the darkness in their own heart. It stood as proof that transformation was possible, that redemption was not just a beautiful dream, but a real possibility for anyone willing to do the difficult work of becoming truly human. And the story itself continued to evolve, passed down through generations of storytellers who found in it a reflection of their own struggles and hopes. Each telling brought new insights, new interpretations, new possibilities for understanding what it meant to choose love over fear, growth over stagnation, connection over isolation. For those of us here at Vanishing Legends, the tale of Koschei represents something more than just an ancient story about a sorcerer and a hero destruction and creation, for both despair and hope. It reminds us, it speaks to the eternal human capacity for both good and evil, for both that the most important battles are not fought with swords and spells, but in the quiet moments when we choose how to respond to our own fears and desires. The legend challenges us to examine our own hearts, to ask ourselves what we might be willing to sacrifice in our own fear of loss, what lines we might be tempted to cross in our desire for control, what prices we might be willing to pay to avoid the vulnerability that comes with truly loving another person. And perhaps most importantly, it asks us whether we believe that redemption is possible, even for those who seem ever find their way back to the light. These to have traveled too far down the path of darkness, to are not comfortable questions, and the story of Koschei does not offer comfortable answers, but that is precisely what makes it so powerful and so enduring. It refuses to let us retreat into simple categories of good and evil, hero and monster. Instead, it forces all its capacity for both transcendent beauty us to grapple with the complex reality of human nature, with and terrible ugliness. In the end, the true us to be better than we are, to love more deeply, to forge magic of Koschei's story, lies not in the spells and transformations that fill its pages, but in its ability to transform those who encounter it. It challenges, if more readily, to hope more persistently. It reminds us that no matter how far we may have fallen, no matter how many mistakes we may have made, the possibility of redemption remains open to us, waiting for the moment when we finally find the courage to choose love over fear. The deathless sorcerer had finally learned the secret that had eluded him for centuries. True immortality was not to be found in avoiding death, but in living so fully, so authentically, so lovingly, that the impact of that life would continue to ripple outward long after the body had returned to dust. In choosing mortality, Koschei had achieved something far greater than the immortality he had once sought. He had achieved a kind of eternal meaning that no amount of magic could ever provide. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of his tale, that the things we fear most, the losses we spend our lives trying to avoid, the vulnerabilities we desperately try to protect, these are not obstacles to a meaningful existence. They are the very things that make meaning possible in the first place. The story of Koschei the Deathless thus becomes something far more profound than a simple cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking immortality. It becomes a roadmap for understanding the very essence of what makes us human, what gives our brief lives meaning in an infinite universe. Every culture has its monsters, its dark mirrors that reflect our deepest fears and most troubling impulses. But few have created a figure as psychologically complex as the deathless sorcerer of Slavic folklore. If you're fascinated by these dark explorations of human nature and want to discover more legendary creatures that reveal the hidden truths about ourselves and our ancestors, make sure to subscribe to Vanishing Legends and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into the folklore that shapes civilizations, uncovering the psychological and spiritual truths buried within ancient stories. The genius of Koschei's legend lies in how it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own relationship with mortality, power, and love. In our modern world, we may not hide our souls in needles or build castles from the bones of our enemies, but we still face the same fundamental choice that defined his character. Do we embrace the vulnerability that comes with being truly alive? Or do we construct elaborate defenses to protect ourselves from loss, pain, and change? Consider how many people today live lives that mirror Koschei's immortal existence in disturbing ways. They accumulate wealth not for the joy of abundance, but out of fear of scarcity. They seek to control their environments and relationships, not from love, but from terror. Human connection in pursuit of power and security. They are protecting themselves, when in reality, they are creating their own prisons. The modern workplace offers countless examples of this phenomenon. How of uncertainty? They build walls around their hearts, thinking many corporate executives have sacrificed their capacity for genuine. How many people spend their days in jobs that drain their life force, convinced that this is the price of survival, never realizing they have become their own version of the living dead? The tale of Koschei the Deathless ultimately reveals a profound truth about the human condition. We are all caught between the desire for security and the need for authentic connection, between our fear of mortality and our hunger for meaningful existence. The deathless sorcerer's journey from monster to man reminds us that redemption is always possible, but it requires the courage to embrace our own vulnerability and mortality. In our modern age, where we often seek to control and possess rather than love and serve, Koschei's story serves as both warning and hope. It challenges us to examine what we might be sacrificing in our own quest for immortality, whether through wealth, power, or the illusion of permanence. The needle containing his soul becomes a mirror for our own hidden fears and the elaborate defenses we construct to protect ourselves from life's inevitable losses. Here at Vanishing Legends, we believe these ancient stories hold keys to understanding ourselves and our place in the world. They remind us that the most profound transformations come not through avoiding death, but through choosing to live fully in the face of our mortality. If these explorations into the dark wisdom of folklore have moved you, make sure to subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the buried truths that shaped human consciousness. The legends may be vanishing, but their power to transform us remains eternal.